What began as a quiet medical check spiraled into a revelation so earth-shaking that it brought Princess Beatrice to her knees with DNA results that rewrote the story of her very existence. For years, Beatrice had moved through life with the unshakable belief that her place in the royal family was not just ceremonial, but written into her very blood. From the day she was born, her lineage was presented to her as unbreakable.
What began as a routine medical appointment inside the Palace of Veronia would end up cracking open a secret that had been buried for 26 years. Princess Alara of Veronia had never once questioned where she came from. From the moment she could speak, she had been told the story of her bloodline the way other children were told fairy tales, not as something to be doubted, but as something to be memorized. She was the daughter of Crown Prince Alaric and Princess Yold, third in line to a throne that had stood for over 4 centuries. Her portrait hung beside her father's in the East Gallery. Her name was stitched into royal tapestries. Doubt was not a language she had ever been taught to speak. The appointment itself had seemed almost beneath notice. The royal physician, Dr. Cashinren, had recommended a full genetic panel as part of a new health initiative the palace was quietly piloting, a way to get ahead of hereditary conditions that had quietly plagued the family for generations, including a heart arrhythmia that had claimed Alara's grandfather far too young. It was framed as precaution, nothing more. Alara barely thought about it as the nurse drew her blood. She signed a consent form between sips of tea, made a joke about hoping she hadn't inherited her father's terrible eyesight, and went back to her afternoon of correspondence and charity planning without giving it another thought. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at her private study, marked confidential and addressed only to her. She almost set it aside for later. There were seating charts for a state dinner to finalize, and a foundation report due to the board by Friday. But something about the weight of it, the formality of the seal, made her open it first. She remembers, even now, the strange sensation of her own hands feeling unfamiliar as she broke the wax and unfolded the pages inside. The language was clinical, precise, utterly indifferent to what it was about to do to her. Her eyes moved down the columns of genetic markers, not really understanding most of it, until they landed on a single line near the bottom. Paternity exclusion confirmed. Probability of biological relation to listed father, 0%. She read it 4 times before the words rearranged themselves into something she could not unsee. The room did not spin dramatically, the way it might in a film. It simply went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when every assumption a person has built their identity on is suddenly gone, and there is nothing yet to replace it with. Alara has since described that afternoon as the moment she stopped being certain of anything. For the rest of that day, she told no one. She sat with the letter locked in the drawer of her writing desk and went through the motions of her scheduled appearances, a ribbon cutting at a new children's hospital wing, a photograph with a group of visiting school children, a smile that felt borrowed from someone else's face. It was only that night, alone in her private quarters, that the weight of it broke through. She has spoken since about sitting on the floor of her bathroom for nearly an hour, unable to stop crying, unable to explain to herself why a piece of paper had the power to unmake 26 years of memory. Every birthday her father had celebrated with her. Every lesson he'd given her on horseback as a child. Every quiet nod of approval after a difficult public appearance. None of it had changed. And yet all of it now felt like it was standing on ground that had just been proven to be an illusion. The next morning, she did what no one expected her to do so quickly. She went directly to her mother. Princess Yold had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of composure. It was, in many ways, the most valuable skill the monarchy had trained into her, more valuable than any language or diplomatic protocol. But when Alara placed the letter on the table between them and asked, simply, "Who is he?" that composure did not hold. Alara recalls her mother's hands trembling as she reached for the paper, recalls the long silence before Yold finally looked up, and recalls, most of all, the moment her mother said quietly, "I always knew this day might come." What followed was not the fairy tale Alara had been raised on, but it was, in its own way, a very human story, the kind that royal families are rarely permitted to tell in public. Decades earlier, During a period when the pressures of an arranged and increasingly strained marriage had worn Yoel down to something brittle, she had found an unexpected friendship with a man named Tomas Reyes, a landscape architect who had been brought in to redesign the palace's eastern gardens. He was not part of court life. He had no title, no political ambitions, no interest in the machinery of the monarchy at all, which, Yoel admitted, was precisely what had drawn her to him. For a handful of months, in a life that otherwise felt entirely scripted, he had been the one part of her world that felt like it belonged only to her. It had not been planned as anything more than that. But when Yoel discovered she was pregnant, she made a decision in an instant that she would spend the rest of her life quietly carrying, to say nothing, to let the child be raised as the heir everyone already believed her to be, and to bury the truth so completely that even she, at times, had almost convinced herself it wasn't real. Tomas Reyes finished his contract with the palace within the year and was never spoken of again. Yoel told Alara that she had thought, for a long time, that silence was an act of protection for her marriage, for the monarchy, and eventually for Alara herself, who she believed would be safer never knowing. Alara did not respond with the composure her mother had hoped for. She has been open in the time since about how much anger sat beneath the grief, not simply at the secret itself, but at the years of small, ordinary moments that now felt reframed. Every time she had been told she had her father's stubbornness. Every time a courtier had remarked on some supposed family resemblance. It wasn't that those moments had been cruel. It was that they had been built on a story everyone else had been allowed to help write, except her. The confrontation with Prince Alaric, when it finally came, was quieter than Alara expected. She had braced herself for anger, for denial, for the kind of wounded pride she associated with the men of her family. Instead, she found a man who told her plainly that he had known for over 20 years. He had learned the truth not long after Alara's 5th birthday, during a period of private testing prompted by an unrelated medical concern, and had made the decision, alongside Yoel, never to raise it. "You were my daughter the day you were born," he told her, "and nothing in that report changes what I chose every day after that." It was, Alara has said, both the most comforting and the most devastating thing anyone had said to her throughout the entire ordeal, because it forced her to hold two truths at once: that his love had been real, and that it had also been built, deliberately, on a foundation she had never been allowed to see. For weeks, Alara withdrew from public life almost entirely, citing a private health matter in the brief statement the palace released. Behind the walls of Veronia, however, she was doing something far harder than resting. She was trying to figure out who she was without the certainty she had spent her whole life leaning on. She spoke with a therapist for the first time. She read through old letters her mother had kept, searching for some trace of the man whose blood she now knew she carried. And eventually, quietly, without informing the press office, she reached out to Tomas Reyes himself. He was 61 years old, living a modest life 2 provinces away, running a small nursery business with his wife of many years. He had never married Yoel, never sought any acknowledgement, and had, in fact, moved on so completely that he had assumed the secret would simply die with the people who kept it. When Alara's letter arrived, he has said his first instinct was disbelief, followed almost immediately by fear. Fear of the scandal his own existence might cause for a young woman he had never met but had, in some abstract way, always wondered about. Their first meeting took place not in a palace, but in the small greenhouse behind his home, surrounded by rows of orchids he had spent years cultivating. Alara has described it since as one of the strangest and most grounding afternoons of her life, sitting across from a stranger who shared her exact eye color, her habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking, and a stubborn streak neither of them had ever been able to explain to anyone else. There was no dramatic embrace, no cinematic reconciliation. There was, instead, something quieter. 2 people carefully, cautiously, beginning to acknowledge a connection that had existed their entire lives without either of them knowing it. News of the paternity result did eventually reach the press, not through any leak from the palace, but through a junior lab technician who recognized the name on the file and sold the story to a tabloid for a sum that would end her career the moment she was identified. The headlines that followed were exactly as loud and as merciless as Alara had feared. Newspapers ran side-by-side photographs of her and Tomas Reyes, dissecting their features for resemblance. Commentators speculated endlessly about her place in the line of succession, about whether the monarchy's centuries-old rules of legitimacy even had language for a situation like this. For several days, Veronia's palace press office was overwhelmed, unable to keep pace with a story that had outgrown their ability to manage it. What surprised nearly everyone, including Ilara herself, was the tone the public conversation eventually settled into. Rather than the scandal-hungry pile-on the tabloids had clearly hoped for, much of the public response was sympathetic. Ordinary people wrote in by the thousands, many sharing their own stories of discovering unexpected family truths through home DNA testing, a phenomenon that had touched far more families outside the palace gates than anyone in the monarchy had ever had to reckon with in public. Ilara, for the first time in her life, found herself being seen not as a distant symbol of tradition, but as someone whose story overlapped, in a very human way, with people who had never set foot in a palace. The legal and constitutional questions, however, did not resolve themselves so gently. Veronia's centuries-old succession laws had never anticipated a case exactly like this one, and for a period of nearly 2 months, government ministers, royal historians, and constitutional lawyers debated in closed session what Ilara's biological parentage meant for her formal standing. In the end, the Crown's legal counsel reached a decision that surprised almost no one who understood the actual structure of the monarchy. Legitimacy within Veronia's royal house had never been defined strictly by biology, but by formal recognition and marriage at the time of birth, meaning that, legally, nothing about Ilara's position in the line of succession changed at all. It was Prince Alaric, in the end, who had to publicly reaffirm what he had privately told his daughter weeks earlier. She was his daughter, in every sense the law, and his own heart recognized, and that would not change. For Ilara, the legal resolution brought relief, but it did not erase the deeper reckoning she had been forced into. In the months that followed, she chose to speak publicly about the experience herself, in a rare and unusually candid televised interview that drew record viewership across the region. She did not frame it as scandal. She framed it as a story about identity, about the difference between the family you are given and the family you choose to keep loving even after the story changes. She spoke about her father, Alaric, with open affection, making clear that nothing about their relationship had been diminished. She spoke, too, about Tomas Reyes, describing the strange gift of discovering, in her late 20s, an entirely new relationship built from nothing but curiosity and honesty rather than obligation. What began as a single sealed envelope had, by the end of that year, reshaped not only how Ilara understood her own life, but how an entire nation thought about the fragile, human architecture that even the oldest institutions are built on. The Palace of Veronia, for all its centuries of carefully managed appearances, had been forced to admit something it had spent generations trying to avoid, that behind every crown is simply a family, capable of the same secrets, the same silences, and the same slow, painful work of telling the truth that every other family eventually has to do. Princess Ilara returned to public life gradually, choosing her engagements with more care than before and speaking, when she did, with a directness that had not been part of her public persona previously. She has said that the hardest part was never the DNA result itself, but the years of unspoken tension she had once mistaken for peace, the silences she had never questioned, because she had never had a reason to. Now, she says, she asks more questions. She has told close friends that she no longer mistakes stillness for honesty. As for the monarchy itself, the incident prompted a quiet but meaningful shift in how Veronia's royal family approached its own history. New protocols were introduced around genetic testing and medical privacy, developed in part with Ilara's own input, designed to ensure that no future member of the family would have to learn something so profound from a sealed envelope delivered without warning. It was a small procedural change, but for Ilara it represented something larger, proof that even an institution built on centuries of silence could, when finally forced to, choose transparency instead. There were, of course, harder days too, days the interviews and headlines never captured. Ilara has spoken privately, and later more openly, about the strange grief of mourning a version of her life that had never technically existed, but had felt entirely real for 26 years. She describes it as a kind of loss without a funeral, one nobody quite knew how to comfort her through, because on paper nothing tragic had happened at all. Her father was alive. Her mother was alive. She had, if anything, gained a family rather than lost one. And yet there were nights, she admits, when she grieved the simple, uncomplicated certainty she used to carry without even noticing it was there. Her relationship with her mother took the longest to rebuild. It was not anger that stood between them in the end, but something closer to disappointment. The difficult realization that a person can love you completely and still choose, for years, not to trust you with the truth about your own life. Yol, for her part, has said she understood that disappointment better than anyone, having spent 3 decades carrying the same secret alone. The two women found their way back to each other slowly, through long walks in the palace gardens that had once been redesigned by the very man at the center of it all, and through conversations that neither of them rushed. Alara has said that her mother's willingness, finally, to answer every question without flinching did more to repair their relationship than any apology could have. Her bond with Tomas Reyes grew in its own unhurried way. He never asked for a title, never accepted the modest allowance the palace's lawyers quietly offered him, and never once positioned himself as anything other than what he was, a man who had, by circumstance rather than intention, become part of her story later than he should have. Alara began visiting his greenhouse several times a year, always without press, always without announcement. She learned slowly the names of the orchids he had spent a lifetime cultivating, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she had inherited his patience for slow, careful things. It was not the relationship of father and daughter in any conventional sense. It was something new, built entirely on the years they'd missed rather than the years they'd shared, and both of them seemed to understand that trying to force it into a more familiar shape would only diminish it. Public fascination with the story faded, as it always eventually does, replaced by newer headlines and newer scandals belonging to other families. But within Veronia's palace walls, something had shifted permanently. Younger members of the royal household began speaking more openly about the pressure of maintaining appearances at the expense of honesty, citing Alara's experience as evidence that the institution could survive the truth, that it had, in fact, survived it rather well. Historians would later point to that period as a quiet turning point in how the monarchy understood its own transparency, not because any law had dramatically changed, but because one woman had insisted, at great personal cost, on being told the truth about her own life. In the years since, Alara has spoken about that period not as the moment her identity was destroyed, but as the moment it finally became fully her own. She still carries the title she was born into. She still walks the same palace halls she grew up in. But she carries, too, a second, quieter story now, one about a greenhouse full of orchids.